In Japan, samurai have an exalted and distinguished place in Japanese history. However, at the peak of his creative genius, Akira Kurosawa told a story that demystified the samurai, portraying them as more complex and human. Hello, I'm Peter Garrett, and this is the Criterion Chronicle. Welcome to the Criterion Chronicle. I'm your host, Peter Garrett. Now, the Criterion Chronicle is the chronological journey through the Criterion Collection, starting from DVD spine number 1. Now, today, the second stop on our journey is one of the greatest films of all time, Akira Kurosawa, spine number 2, Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Now, I know most of you probably know the plot, but for the uninitiated, I will give a quick overview. Just because, there's always a couple people that might not exactly know what it is. But, so Seven Samurai tells the story of a village of farmers that are being terrorized by a group of bandits. Now, because of this, they're forced to harvest food for them. And in response to this threat, the farmers decide to hire samurai in order to protect the village. It's a very straightforward plot, and a plot that is actually shown up in many different forms in many different movies, which I will talk about later. But that is the core of Seven Samurai. Now, Seven Samurai holds a very significant place in film history, and particularly in Japanese film history. The reason being is because it was one of the two breakthrough films of 1954 that really put Japanese cinema on the map. It was Seven Samurai was one of them, and then the other was Ishiro Honda's classic Godzilla. The kaiju film that started it all, which actually is the oldest film franchise still in existence. So, granted, now, even though Seven Samurai put him on the map, it wasn't the first film that Kurosawa got international recognition for. So in 1950, Kurosawa's film Rashomon was a sensation, was an international sensation, but it was mainly in the film festival circuit that it got a lot of this attention and accolades. But because of its success there, it eventually became the first Oscar winner for the best foreign film. Now, granted, the foreign film category didn't exist back then, so it was actually a special Oscar that it was awarded to. But because of the nature of how strong Rashomon was, that prompted the Academy to create the category from then on. So, but again, even though Rashomon was this, breakout hit, it was Seven Samurai and Godzilla that truly transcended Japan. So, and one of the reasons why I think this was such a good thing for the Japanese film industry is because both films showed the full breadth of Japanese cinema, with Seven Samurai exemplifying the pinnacle of human drama and action and technical craft, and Godzilla just being a pure, thrilling, entertaining movie. And, And Seven Samurai was also a period film, whereas Godzilla was a contemporary science fiction film. So now there were other Japanese filmmakers at the time, like Yasujiro Ozu and Kenji Mizoguchi, but they were considered more purely Japanese filmmakers. Ozu and Mizoguchi's stories spoke directly to Japanese culture and the Japanese experience. Ozu had films like Late Spring or Tokyo Story, which are both fantastic, and they focused on contemporary life in Japan and family relationships, whereas Kenji Mizoguchi had films like The Life of Oharu and Ugetsu, which were domestic dramas set in Japan's past. So, but Kurosawa was different. Kurosawa's films were seen to be more Western influenced, or at least and more Western accessible, which is why I think he was the first of those three to really break out from Japan to the rest of the world. So, but Kurosawa, Ozu, and Mizoguchi are considered kind of the three pillars, the three titans of classic Japanese cinema. But again, whereas Ozu and Mizoguchi were looked at as the more domestic, the domestic directors, Kurosawa was the international, the Western influence, because, and a lot of his films took cues from, Western influences. So, some of the masters that he took influence from were William Shakespeare and especially John Ford, the director John Ford. So, and I mean, his love of Western entertainment and literature and plays and films, for instance, with Shakespeare, Kurosawa would end up adapting 3 Shakespeare plays into films. The first one was 1957's Throne of Blood, which is an adaptation of Macbeth. The second one was 1960's The Bad Sleep Well, which is an adaptation of Hamlet. And finally, one of his greatest films of all time, and a lot of people consider his his magnum opus in a way, his last, amazing work of art, was 1985's Rōnin, which is an adaptation of King Lear. But I think the reason why he was so influenced by the West is why the West was, why Europe, the United States, they were able to understand and process his movies a lot better than than his other contemporaries. And again, Ozu and Mizoguchi are phenomenal filmmakers, and I love all of them. But again, when you watch a Kurosawa film it feels more accessible, typically story-wise. So I think, and it's because of that his work was able to transcend, Japan so well. And it's also why there have been so many remakes and adaptations of Kurosawa's, films and his scripts. Something else that I will talk about, down the line. But and here's the thing, is because and it's not like Kurosawa was not patriotic, or he wasn't Japanese. There are a lot of things in his films that are inherently Japanese. It's just he was able to broaden his stories in a way to make them feel just, I guess, more universal. So, there are films from many countries that, when you see a film, you think this is a quintessential film from this country. This speaks to the culture of this country, to its people, to its language. Whereas some films just are so transcendent. And I think that's where Kurosawa's success really came, because his early films were actually a lot more Japanese focused. His early, 1940 films like Senshiro Sugata and The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, those are very, very Japanese films. But Seven Samurai was again his breakout. And the thing is because in Japanese, and again, in most countries' cinema, there are certain cultural traits and nuances that are necessary to understand it. So, for instance, to be able to fully appreciate a movie by Yasujiro Ozu or Kenji Mizoguchi, you kind of have to have a little bit more, not a lot, but you kind of have to have a little bit more familiarity with the culture, because otherwise then some of the films might not land as strong, because you're left kind of confused, being like, well, why is this happening? And and kind of, again, it leaves you a little more trying to figure out what's going on in certain ways, even though the stories, again, are still beautiful stories. But there's still, you might have to do a little bit of homework to be able to watch an Ozu or a Mizoguchi film, whereas Kurosawa, you can jump right in, never having seen a Kurosawa film, and understand it probably almost entirely. And the thing with Kurosawa is that, again, his universality is what makes him, I think, again, what has made him one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. So, and Seven Samurai in particular belongs to a specific genre of Japanese films. In Japanese cinema, there are two main categories of films. There's the Jidai-geki, which literally directly translated means period drama. And then there is the Gendai-geki, which are the contemporary dramas. Now, Kurosawa made both types of films in his career, but arguably his most famous films like Rashomon, The Hidden Fortress, and Seven Samurai are Jidai-geki. And, a little history about Jidai-geki is Jidai-geki actually emerged mainly from the Japanese theater, specifically kabuki, because kabuki theater, their plays, most of the plays in kabuki focus on, are period pieces. So, so it didn't start out as a film genre. It started out as a theater genre, and then was transferred over to film. But Kurosawa had an interesting mindset, because Kurosawa believed the theatrical influence wasn't really appropriate for film. And thus, he embarked on creating a more realistic canvas for his stories, that took place in the past. So Seven Samurai specifically takes place in the late 16th century, which in Japanese history is referred to as the Sengoku period, or the Warring States period. Now, this specific time period is important because different points in Japanese history allow for different context of the particular story. At this point in time, Japan had a very stratified society with samurai at the top and farmers closer to the bottom. However, due to the chaotic nature of the time period, those social lines were more blurred, which is something that Kurosawa was more drawn towards. Whereas, say, after this period, which is when the Tokugawa period started in, I think, 1603, the society actually got a lot more rigid, where because Japan actually got unified, there was more structure and more stability between the class lines, whereas in the Sengoku period, it was a lot more chaotic. So, now Kurosawa actually drew from historical precedent of the time, finding evidence of samurai and farmers actually teaming up together to help fight alongside each other. And he found that more interesting than what a typical samurai film would be, because a majority of the samurai films would take place during what I just told you, which is the Tokugawa period, during the 17th and the 18th centuries, because the society was a lot more set at that point. But as a result of Kurosawa's fascination with the Sengoku period, he would become the most prominent filmmaker to depict that era. So, and one of the things that I really appreciate about Kurosawa is how his period films feel very lived in. So, and that's actually one of the ways that he is able to create a sense of realism, because he doesn't create, his settings aren't pristine, but they're dirty, they're used, they feel like that people, the sets actually feel like people live there or eat there or whatever, as opposed to just really, really nice studio sets. And again, that adds more realism to the film. So, and one of the things in particular, that I think you would notice specifically, is the architecture in the films. It isn't what you think for Japanese structures. When you think of Japan, you think of, these grand, beautiful, opulent temples and pagodas, these big, Toshi gates. But, in Seven Samurai, the architecture is actually very simple. It's very utilitarian. For instance, the inn that the farmers stay in when they're looking for the samurai, that's a very unassuming place. And I don't even know if it's an inn or if it's just kind of like a shelter in the film. I think it's an inn because it's got the farmers and it's got some other characters, like some other some kind of loser samurai and gamblers and stuff like that. But it doesn't look like when you watch a period film, for instance, from Ozu, and you see, or a period film from, say, Mizoguchi, and you see an inn, they're very nice and they're beautiful, and you're thinking to yourself, oh, I would like to stay there. Whereas the one in the inn in Seven Samurai, you're like, oh, that really? Okay. But again, because we know these farmers don't have a lot of money, so they wouldn't stay in a nice place. So, but then also, other sets, other buildings in the film, the farmer's village, which was actually completely constructed from the ground up. Again, the huts, the homes, they don't look that that impressive. I mean, really, I think the most impressive building in the farmer's village is the mill. And that's because it's, it's got a big water wheel, and it looks different from everything else, but that's, it's a special location. So, but other than that, yeah. So, and then the other major set of the film is the bandits' fortress, their hideout. And again, when you see it, it's bigger than everything else that we've seen. But again, it doesn't look, it has a regular kind of slanted A-frame roof, and it doesn't wow you in regards to its beauty, for instance. So, and I believe that, by not making the structures beautiful, it reinforces the drab and kind of gritty nature of the setting. So, and it's also not distracting, because this movie's not meant to be pretty. It's not meant to be, it's beautifully shot, don't get me wrong, but it's not to be, but whereas there are some filmmakers that, like Ozu, for instance, his films are very beautiful to look at. Whereas I think that, Kurosawa was more interested in creating these, again, these very realistic settings. So, and I think another reason why the film has that feel is because it was filmed primarily on location. So, which always adds a lot more realism to a film. So than shooting in a studio. So, but but you can't help but be impressed over the fact of what he built for the set, especially at the time he built it, because in the 1950s most films were still shot on sound stages. At least they were in Hollywood, and I imagine they were in Japan as well. And I think Seven Samurai was actually the most expensive Japanese film at the time in terms of its budget. So, but he built this, this real village, and we actually get a great sense of scale, because when, in the beginning, when we see, in the beginning and then throughout the film, when we see the bandits and the samurai arrive and looking down onto the village, it gives a real sense of how big it is, which allows us subconsciously to kind of take it in the back of our head, where it's like, okay, we start to understand the layout and the dynamic of this village. And that's one of the things that Kurosawa was always fantastic at. Kurosawa's attention to detail was, exceptional, and it resulted in sets that feel completely authentic and not staged. Like, he would build the full structure. It's not like a backlot where it would just be the facade of a building and then nothing else behind it. He would build a full 3-dimensional building. And the buildings in Seven Samurai looked like they could have been truly inhabited. So now a subgenre of the Jidai-geki is what's called the Chanbara film, or Chanbara, or swordplay story. So Chanbara are often, those are, or samurai films. Those are usually action oriented. There's a lot of sword fights. And this was Seven Samurai is a special film because while the action sequences are spectacular, it's still the human drama that carries the film and is equally as compelling. Because typically Chanbara films, again, like most action films in most places, the action is what's most important. But in Seven Samurai is anchored by its story. So now the film, and what's interesting is because the film actually only has 2 very, very small action sequences in the beginning. The first one is when we're introduced to the samurai Kanbei, and he has to rescue a little boy. And the second scene is when we're introduced to the character of Kyuzo and the duel that he has with another samurai. So, and at that point, after that, there isn't even a big action sequence until more than halfway through the film when the samurai attack the bandits' hideout. But don't worry, it's not like the film gets boring because it doesn't have action for that time. So that's again, that one of the brilliant things about the film is how it moves really well, and especially at being a 3.5 hour long film, there is no wasted space. So even though the action really doesn't kick in until the second half of the film, it's still like an incredibly captivating and amazing film to watch. So, but I will say this though. However, once the final act of the film does kick in, featuring the bandits attacking the village, it is non-stop action. And the thing is, and what's great is that the action, and this is another thing that kind of set this film apart from other Chanbara films, was the action isn't sensationalized or stylized in any way. Later films in the genre would often have, after, they would have, giant blood spurts happening after a sword slash. And, whether by choice or by limitation, due to what was allowed in the 1950s, the violence is much cleaner. So the film's final battle in the rain and mud serve as kind of a reminder that this is not a glamorous endeavor, but this, it's cold, it's wet, and it's exhausting. And in my opinion, what makes this such a fantastic film and a fantastic action film is every action sequence in the film has a specific narrative purpose. A lot of action films, in a standard action film, you might get a lot of gratuitous fights or chase scenes just to keep the audience engaged. But Kurosawa doesn't need to do that. So, and to give an example, with Kanbei's introduction, it's meant to establish his intelligence, his resourcefulness, his efficiency. And so when the scene happens, when he goes to the little hut where there's a thief holding a child, and he's offering some rice balls to kind of disarm the thief in a way, we don't actually, and then he rushes in, we don't actually see the fight that he engages in with the thief. So what happens is he rushes in, and then it immediately cuts to a shot of the doorway, and the thief comes barreling out, mortally wounded. And that's it. And again, we don't need to see the action scene because we already know we already know what happens. So, and then for Kyuzo's introduction, now this time we do get to see the duel, but to establish Kyuzo's expertise in master swordsmanship, the fight is remarkably brief. So it basically it has him with another samurai, and they first start out with these kind of practice like wooden swords, but then when Kyuzo insists that he won and the other samurai doesn't believe him, the other samurai says, well, let's do this again and let's do it for real. And so Kyuzo's like, all right. And then once the real duel happens, it's even faster. So, but then once we get to the second half, that's when the action sequences get bigger. So the attack on the bandits' hideout, which is a preemptive strike as a way to even the odds, that action sequence is bigger, and again the action sequences escalate in the film. So that's another way that's another thing that I think Kurosawa did really well, was because the action sequences start small and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger. But then also his action sequences serve a narrative purpose. They're not just there to be action. They're there to tell part of the story. So for instance, when they go to the hideout, and again, it's meant to as a means of them trying to get rid of some of the bandits so that they're not so overwhelmed. But then also in that scene, it reveals the fate of one of the farmer's wives named, the farmer's name is Rikichi. And we find out that in that scene that his wife was taken by the bandits. But then also that scene is what leads to the first death of the samurai group. So, and then the final battle, which is the biggest, and actually it's not just the final battle, because once the siege of the bandits start, it's over. It's actually a couple of incursions that the bandits do. But the final battle in the rain, that's the most iconic, action sequence of the film. And it's actually considered one of the most spectacular and greatest action sequences in all of film. So, but yeah, and it, but that final scene is just where the entire film just crescendos. It's almost like a symphony, where it builds and builds and builds and builds, and then finally it just hits you with that big finale, and that's what the final battle is. So now, granted, while the setting and the action are strong components of the film, the most prominent and important elements to the film are the characters. So the main dynamic of the film is the farmer's relationship to the samurai, because that represents the broader social structure of the time. So, the establishing objective of hiring samurai to protect the village is initially met with fierce debate. Where some of the farmers argue why samurai would fight for them, or that they can't be trusted, when there's no wealth or prestige in it. But the goal is for them to find samurai that are so noble that they will defend the village for nothing more than rice, essentially. And actually it's the village elder in the beginning that makes the very pragmatic argument by simply saying, hire hungry samurai. So, but the thing is due to their low position in society, the farmers have a very difficult time in the beginning, and finding a samurai to join them. So even though the farmers need them, they clearly have prejudice. And again, that doesn't actually, that doesn't, because even though they're the farmers are beneath the samurai socially, again, that doesn't mean that they don't have their own prejudices and suspicions towards them. So there's a scene where one of the farmers named Monzo demands that his daughter Shino cut her hair and dress like a man as a way to protect her, because he worries that the samurai are going to defile her in some way. So, and then also when the samurai first arrive at the village, no one is there to greet them. And so it's not until Kikuchio, played by Toshiro Mifune, sounds the alarm and scares them out of hiding do they show up, which ends up leading to him calling them out for their rudeness. So again, it's these moments in the film, these dynamic moments where, with the farmers interacting with the samurai. And what's interesting is actually Rikichi's character. He's the most prominent farmer character. He is the one that's the least afraid of the samurai. He's the one who's constantly approaching the samurai, talking to them. He's not while his the other farmers that he's with, while they're kind of cowering and worried about what's going to happen, and like, why don't we need to just go home. We need to abandon this. Rikichi is adamant. He's the one who initially in the village is like, we need to hire samurai. He's the one who, when they get to the town, he's the one who's always approaching the samurai. So he's one of the two characters that's almost a bridge between the samurai and the farmers. So, but one of the most original aspects to the film, is how it truly demystifies the samurai. So now the samurai, they're still brave and they're still honorable men, but the film portrays them in a much more realistic manner. They aren't these larger than life characters. They don't stand or pose in a way that's meant to be obviously heroic. So actually, it's the Kurosawa does a lot to humble the samurai in many ways. So, for instance, when Kanbei is introduced, the first thing we see him do is shaving his head in order to disguise himself as a monk in order to save the child. Now, again, to a regular audience, to us, we might not understand what the significance of that is. But in the context of the samurai, the cutting of one's hair is extremely significant because, at that time, a samurai's top knot was a clear sign of social status. And so cutting that hair would be considered a monumental action because you're essentially cutting off your status symbol right there. But by shaving his head, Kanbei shows that he cares more about the life of the child than his own place in society. So, and Kanbei's act is so shocking to the townspeople because they understand the weight of it. So there's a large crowd that gathers to watch him do it. You think to yourself, well, why do all these people need to watch him just shaving his head? But it's because the nature of what he's doing. So that is one of the that's one of the ways that Kurosawa establishes that these samurai are not going to be your garden variety high class people. It's the same thing when we meet Heihachi when he's chopping wood. Chopping wood is a very I want to say regular task that a farmer would do or any kind of person would do. It's something that would most likely be considered beneath him, but he's somebody who's in a position where he needs to either make a little money or get a little food, and if he's got to do that by chopping wood, that's what he's got to do. So and the thing is I think that Kurosawa, again, he didn't have samurai that are these successful, that were, these amazing warriors in the sense that they've had a lot of successes. These are not successful warriors that have won many battles. There are multiple times in the film when the samurai are talking about losing battles or even just running away to survive. So, and it's moments like that, for instance, when Kanbei is talking to the young samurai Katsushiro, because Katsushiro witnesses Kanbei's saving of the child and instantly has this kind of hero worship of him, and so he immediately wants to be his apprentice and learn from Kanbei. But when Katsushiro is already kind of putting him on a pedestal, Kanbei's like, no, I've lost a lot of battles, so I'm not your guy. So and again, and it's the same thing when Gorobe is who is the second in command after Kanbei. He's the one who ends up finding Heihachi when he's chopping wood. So and then also when Kanbei and meets his old comrade Shichiroji, they're reminiscing about past battles, and so Kanbei is asking Shichiroji in particular, how did you get away from the last battle? And Shichiroji is basically like, well, I just kind of I hid and I got away. So again, it's not these and again, I'm not trying to say that the characters, it's not like they're not heroic, they're not cowards, but they fight and they lose, and their win is really that they survive and that they get to fight another day. But another thing that Kurosawa did that was different than a lot of Chanbara films, and was kind of antithetical to the time period, was he gives the samurai moments of genuine connection and sympathy towards the farmers. So, for instance, there's a scene early on when the farmers, because the farmers the only thing they have to entice samurai is the fact that they have rice. So, and at one point, one of the other farmers, Yohei, who's in charge of watching over the rice, we find out that somehow he either, I don't know if it's because he, we don't see in the film whether if it was because he fell asleep or because he wasn't there, but apparently the rice that they brought with them is gone. And Rikichi is, furious, and he's, reprimanding Yohei, but as this fight, because they're like, how are we going to hire the samurai? We have no rice left. Katsushiro comes in, and he basically throws some money on the floor for them to buy more rice. And it's not a moment where Katsushiro plays it as, hey, you owe me, or this is, I've got wealth and everything like that. It's very silent kind of, Katsushiro understands their problem, gives him money, and then he just turns and walks away. So, and then there's another example is when, throughout the film, the farmer Rikichi, we see little moments when, because I mentioned earlier about his wife having been captured by the bandits, but we don't know this yet at this point. So there are moments when some of the samurai characters say to him, when are you going to get married? And he responds in a very kind of, his reaction is very strong, and, he has a very kind of clear, upset reaction, which we don't get and the samurai don't get. So there is one point where he's sitting alone by a fire, and Heihachi goes to talk to him to try to, just to try to connect with him, to try to get him to maybe open up. So, and again, so that's a very human moment between the samurai, between a samurai character and the farmer. So, and then a third example of this is when the character Manzo discovers that Shino and Katsushiro have been intimate with each other. And so he basically goes into a rage towards his daughter because his daughter defied him. His daughter, and also by doing that, now he believes that he, in his words, he says she is now damaged goods because she essentially gave up her virginity to a samurai. So, but, while Manzo is in this, point of rage, both Kanbei and Shichiroji try to console him and try to say, hey, they're young, they're kids, these things happen. This happens in palaces. They try to empathize with him. They try to reach out to him to say it's not that bad. So it's actually not until it's not until and he kind of stonewalls them. But it's not until Rikichi actually says, at least you still have your daughter, because obviously at this point we know his wife was taken and his wife died at the hideout at the bandits' fortress. So, and Manzo, it kind of snaps Manzo kind of back into, hey, this could be worse. So now all of the samurai heroes in the film are Rōnin, specifically, meaning that they have no current master or lord. So, they're basically free for hire, they're mercenaries. So, and, during the recruitment portion of the film in the beginning, Kanbei actually, to go back to the demystification, Kanbei explicitly says that the life of a samurai can be lonely and ultimately unfulfilling in a lot of ways. Because you fight these battles, you do this stuff, but then what are you left with? And again, that was something that was a great subversion of samurai history and culture, because the idea, but, and I'll talk about it a little more later, in terms of the conventions of the, of Chanbara films and samurai films. But Kanbei's kind of downplaying of the life of a samurai is juxtaposed with the enthusiasm and the idealism of Katsushiro, who he's, and which makes sense because he's the youngest and he's the most inexperienced samurai of the group. So now one of the things that the film did that was that became a very revolutionary technique and sought after was, the creating of the team. So, and in Seven Samurai, each member of the team of the seven has a distinct personality, so that allows them to bring a unique perspective and sometimes a philosophy to the group. So, of the seven, you have Kanbei, who is the wise and he's the patient leader. So you have Gorobe, who becomes his second in command. So he's reliable, he's steadfast. You have Katsushiro, who's the young, and idealistic, and he's the eager student. He's the one who believes that, battle is still this kind of glorious and honorable thing, in a way. And then you have Shichiroji, who's the trusted and loyal ally to Kanbei, who's there when Kanbei says, when he asks him, we're in for another fight, but there's nothing in this for us except for protecting these people. And immediately Shichiroji's like, I'm in, let's do it. So, and then you have Heihachi, who's the funniest character. He's the playful Zen humorist. He's the one who's, creating nicknames and making jokes. And, he's the one who Gorobe actually says, even though Heihachi admits he's not the greatest swordsman, Gorobe still thinks that from a morale perspective, he's valuable to the group. And then you have Kyuzo, who is the quiet master swordsman. So you have Kyuzo, who's the quiet master swordsman. He's the one he is all the talent. He's the one who he can put down one opponent with one cut. And then the final character who is the star of the film, as it were, is Kikuchiyo, played by Toshiro Mifune. He's the angry, funny, aggressive wild card. He's the wild man of the group. The film itself has has a triangle. So you have the farmers, you have the samurai, and then you have the bandits. Now, what's interesting though is because the bandits themselves are samurai. And what makes it, because at the time, again, because a lot of these samurai were masterless, they didn't have, a lot of the samurai had to resort to pillaging and stealing and everything just to get by. So, but what the film does, it creates this full spectrum of what samurai at the time chose to pursue, whether that was more heroic endeavors in the case, or in the case of the bandits, power, intimidation, and terror. So, because, the bandits have no personal animosity towards the village. They just see it as a resource to exploit and plunder, which they see as their right, because as samurai, they rank much higher in social standing than the farmers. And the thing is other samurai have terrorized this village, but they have come to a brutal end, as it were, at the hands of the farmers. And this is shown when the character of Kikuchiyo finds and shows off, the armor and the weaponry that the farmers took from the dead or the dying samurai, much to the other samurai's disgust. And so I think that the bandits serve as a mirror image to Kanbei's group. The seven represent traditional valor and honor. The bandits represent the rejection of honor in the name of power. But the bandits also represent modernity and technological progress, because the bandits use guns compared to the seven using only swords, staff weapons, or bows. And it's interesting because every death in the Seven Samurai group occurs as a result of a musket, of a gun. So, and I think that, that was a subtle implication that the samurai will eventually be completely undone by technological advancements, around 300 years later. So now a central theme of the film is the nature of heroism, which is what what makes the samurai heroic in the film is not their abilities as warriors or their triumphs in battles, but something much more human. Their heroism derives from their compassion and their willingness to protect the weaker farmers for no more than just rice. So I think, the seven heroes are Kurosawa's way of showing samurai that actually live up to the ideals of what it means to be a samurai, to be honorable, to live by, Bushido, because it's by helping those that are less fortunate for very little in return. And Kanbei, who is, the wisest character in the film, Kanbei understands that in reality, heroism often comes in a thankless way. Saving the village from the bandits leads to no tangible rewards like money or position. In fact, Kanbei actually says at the very end that he says, in the end, we still lost, and that the true victory belongs to them, to the farmers. So, but that's not to say the farmers aren't heroic too. The farmers do show true heroism as well. In the Sengoku period, farmers had no way to protect themselves from the predations of the samurai. But again, it's Rikichi who makes the decision to defy social norms and seek out samurai protectors. So again, that creates a truly unique storyline. And again, when you examine heroism from that perspective, that all of these characters, the samurai and the farmers, are able to be heroic. Even Yohei, who's one of the most, unfortunately, he's one of the most cowardly characters in the film. We see him slowly go from this kind of very, this kind of weak, very scared, guy to getting to kind of embracing this, becoming a defender of his village. So, and it's actually a very heavy moment when his character gets killed because he was dying protecting the village, and he was able to rise up. So now the film has a true ensemble cast, and it features many wonderful actors, but the film has a clear, spectacular, singular performance by an acting titan and legend. Toshiro Mifune is widely considered one of the greatest actors in Japanese cinematic history. And there are many of them that put him at the very top. So, and for good reason. He just oozed charisma and presence when he was on camera. So, and actually Kurosawa discovered him very early on in Mifune's career. So, Mifune actually, and Mifune ended up having a very long relationship with Kurosawa. He ended up starring in 16 of his films, or a little over half of them. So his first film with Kurosawa was 1948's Drunken Angel. But it was Mifune's performance as, it's Mifune's performance as Kikuchiyo, which is my favorite in the film. And I actually think it's his best performance in any film. So in most of Mifune's films that I've seen, which are predominantly Kurosawa films and a few others, he tends to play very serious characters, and, his performances in the roles, they're very composed, they're calm, and they're stoic. He often feels like he's the smartest guy in the room. But in Seven Samurai, he is a force of nature, unlike any of his other performances in his career. I mean, Kurosawa just let him loose. He allowed him to be a lot more uninhibited in his portrayal of Kikuchiyo. So much so that his character just jumps off the screen as you watch him. It's something that actually some of the other actors were envious of, because the other characters were a lot more, strictly written on the page, whereas Toshiro Mifune was just given carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. So, and he took that and he ran with it. So now, because, it's interesting because Kikuchiyo is essentially the exact opposite of Takashi Shimura's Kanbei. Again, Kanbei is wise, he's thoughtful, he is, intelligent, whereas Kikuchiyo often goes off half-cocked. He's emotional. He's driven by impulses, which makes him a loose cannon in a lot of ways. What I think is really fascinating is the fact that Mifune was actually not supposed to play Kikuchiyo. At one point in the script, there were only 6 samurai, and Kurosawa originally envisioned Mifune to play Kyuzo instead, but realized that it wouldn't work. So he had him and the other screenwriters created Kikuchiyo especially for him. So, and one of the most enjoyable aspects of his performance is how playful Mifune gets to be. So, Seven Samurai is one of the very few instances of Mifune getting to play a purely just comedic and fun character. And due to the comedic nature of the role, Mifune, said this was the most challenging performance of his career. So, but Kikuchiyo is the funniest character in the film. He makes jokes and silly faces. For instance, there's a scene where he's brought, his kind of big introduction scene. We see him in glimpses earlier in the film. He's in the very beginning when Kanbei rescues the child. Kikuchiyo is watching, and Kikuchiyo kind of follows Kanbei just like the farmers are and just like Katsushiro is. But we don't get Kikuchiyo's first big scene until, ostensibly the group has been solidified. The 6, they're ready to go. But then one of the other guys who was at one of the kind of slovenly gamblers said, "Oh, I found this amazing samurai that you're going to have to want to take with you," and it is Kikuchiyo that's brought in. But Kikuchiyo is just hammered when he comes in. So it's a very funny scene because it's him just kind of at his biggest, most theatrical in the film. And what Kurosawa did was Kurosawa actually in general was a very hands-off director when it came to directing actors. So all of his actors, obviously benefited from this, but Mifune was the one who, doing Kikuchiyo, is the one who probably benefited the most, and it's why his character pops off the screen as much as he did. And I think it's actually unfortunate that Mifune wasn't given more opportunities to play characters like these. So the only other character I can think of that's similar to him as this was the character when he plays a bandit in Rashomon, where he gets to be kind of this unhinged character as well. But Kikuchiyo was a bigger, more fleshed out character. Now, but Kikuchiyo is not just a buffoon though. Kikuchiyo does serve a strong narrative purpose, and that is because he is the literal bridge between the farmers and the samurai, because he's the only character in the film who is actually both. Kikuchiyo understands the pain and the suffering of the farmers, but he also understands how the farmers operate. So, there's, when Kanbei chastises, so for instance, when Kanbei chastises him for wearing the dead samurai armor, the farmers have, that actually sets Kikuchiyo off, because Kikuchiyo launches into this emotional speech against the other members of the group, saying how the farmers have become vicious and violent as a result of the continual, terror and intimidation and violence that have been brought upon them. So, but that actually makes, in my opinion, Kikuchiyo is the most interesting character in the film, because he's got this dichotomy, because he simultaneously despises the farmers as well as defends them and sticks up for them, which is interesting. So, because he obviously hates them because they remind him of his humble origins, and he doesn't want to see himself as a farmer. He wants to see himself as a samurai. And again, the scene that really shows his disdain for them is when he's sounding the alarm, because after the farmers all run out thinking the bandits are attacking, he basically starts laughing at them and says that, oh, you were hiding from us when you got here, but all of a sudden now the alarm sounds and now you're like, samurai, save us, samurai, where are you? So he berates them for their hypocrisy, for initially hiding from them. So again, he's a very fascinating character. But again, he doesn't, in the same speech where he's chastising the samurai, he doesn't mince words negatively describing the farmers, because he's the only one that knows how they think. He's the one who tells them they're going to be hiding stuff from you. They're not going to, you think that these are what these people are, and this is what they actually are. So, and he's ultimately proven right later on in the film. So, but ultimately it's because of his connection to the farmers that finally makes Kanbei see him as a useful part of the group. So, but I don't want to say it's not all disdain from Kikuchiyo towards the farmer, because he does have some sweet and playful moments, and genuine connection moments with the farmers. Particularly, there's a group of children that kind of become his unofficial fan club. So, and there are a couple scenes where he likes to play to them and he makes them laugh with his antics. But then there's also, again, when, the character of Yohei, he kind of takes Yohei under his wing when they're teaching the farmers how to defend themselves and tactics. He's, Kikuchiyo sees Yohei almost as like a special project. So there's multiple moments in the film where he singles Yohei out in particular to kind of, you might think that he's kind of razzing him a little harder, but I think that's because he cares about Yohei maybe a little more than the rest of the farmers. So, but Kikuchiyo's not all just, laughing and jokes. He does get one very dramatic scene in the film, and that's when, during one of the incursions by the bandits, they actually, when they set fire to part of the village and they set fire to the mill, he and Kanbei actually run towards the mill, because earlier in the film you see a woman and her husband and their child go to the mill because that's where their father, the old man of the village, lives. So when they don't see them come back, they go to rescue them. And as during the rescue, the woman comes out of the mill and she's got the child and she hands the child to Kikuchiyo and then basically falls over dead. But then, and the child is crying in Kikuchiyo's arms. But then ultimately he kind of breaks down and he says, "This child is me." So we get a glimpse at the pain of his character and where he came from. So, which gives his character depth, so he's not just comic relief in the film. So, and I think, Kikuchiyo actually has the most compelling arc in the film of any of the characters. Now, he starts out by being, overconfident and this kind of clown that the other samurai laugh at, to being a respected member of the group. There are multiple scenes where the samurai initially are taunting him or laughing at him or just kind of reminding him how he's just not one of them. So, in the first, I told you in the first part of the film, in his first big scene when he's drunk, there's one part where he actually pulls out a scroll to show his ancestry, to try to prove that he's a samurai. But when he's talking about it, they realize that the person that he took the name after in the scroll was actually born, he'd only be 13 years old. So they laugh at him. And then it culminates in the samurai kind of taking his sword away and kind of leading him on this game of keep away, until he basically just collapses and is like, "The hell with you. I'm done." And basically, passes out. But, and then, there's other moments where they laugh at him, like, when he's attempting to follow them at the village, and they're kind of taunting him they're just kind of making fun of him, or when Heihachi actually creates the samurai banner, and he creates with the 6 circles in the triangle, and the 6 circles are meant to represent the samurai, but then the triangle is meant to represent Kikuchiyo. So it's their way of kind of singling him out. And then there's also a funny scene where he's trying to ride Yohei's horse, and he acts like he's this, master horseman. And then, we see him riding, and then initially they're like, oh, he's not that bad. And then we see that he gets thrown from the horse, and he ends up having to chase after the horse, as well as when they're on their way to the bandits' hideout, same thing. The horse that he's on, the little horse that he's on, just won't listen to him. So he gets off trying to yell at the horse and trying to get the horse to move. But then the horse decides once he's off, just takes off without him. And then he's left running, and he's like, sorry, I didn't mean it. So, he gets a lot of these, these kind of silly scenes. And then and then we get another scene where he is kind of sleeping on the watch, and as a way to teach him a lesson, Kanbei decides to take his sword away and, sound, kind of an alarm, or not an alarm, but just make a noise to make it seem like the bandits are there to wake him up. And then Kikuchiyo wakes up, and then he's trying to find his sword, and he can't. But and then Kanbei's like, a real samurai wouldn't do this. And so they go out of their way to laugh at him, to taunt him, to make him feel like he's not one of them. And to be fair, it's not completely undeserved, because Kikuchiyo is very ridiculous. One of the ways that his ridiculousness is personified is in his sword, because his sword, his katana, is extraordinarily large, almost as if he's overcompensating for something. So, and not quite what you think, just the fact that he's compensating for the fact that he's not a real samurai. So I think he has the sword to try to be like, hey, I'm a real samurai. See how big my sword is? So, but yeah, but the thing is that, so he's got the moments, he's got these comedic moments, and he's got these moments where he has a lapse in his abilities or his judgment, but he slowly starts to gain the respect, because he shows that he does show that he is a competent fighter. So, for instance, once the bandits start attacking the village, Kikuchiyo, is able to prove himself, as well as during the raid. Kikuchiyo is one of the 3 samurai with Heihachi and Kyuzo that go with Rikichi to the hideout, and he proves himself to be capable in battle there. So, so there are other moments, and then it's his final bravery in the rain battle that is kind of his ultimate heroic moment, where he ends up killing the bandit leader, but it's basically his dying action, because he subsequently dies from being shot right before. So, and then to kind of prove that he became a full peer of the samurai, he's interned with the other 3 by the end. And so when we see him at the end, we see the swords sticking out of the mounds, with one of them being representative of Kikuchiyo. So, and I think the reason why Mifune is so outstanding in Seven Samurai is because he had reached his peak working relationship with the film's director. Now, Seven Samurai was a seminal film in Akira Kurosawa's career, as it was the first samurai film that he made. Now, he had made, again, and I mentioned that he had made 2 other period films. He had made 2 other Jidai-geki before this, which were The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail and Rashomon, which they had samurai, and they had, no, sorry. I misread that. So he had 2 films where samurai were in them, because he had made other Jidai-geki before this, like Senshiro Sagata and Senshiro Sagata Part 2, which were period films, but they didn't have samurai in them. But as far as samurai in films, the Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail and Rashomon had samurai, but they weren't Chanbara films. So and again, Seven Samurai was the most ambitious film of Kurosawa's career up to that point. And maybe some people still think that was his most ambitious film of his entire career. So, but Akira Kurosawa was widely credited as reinventing the samurai film. Because prior to Kurosawa and Seven Samurai, samurai films followed specific film tropes that were established again in Japanese theater in kabuki. Samurai stories often revolved around a samurai's duty to the unflinching loyalty of their master or lord. So because that was a very prized part of samurai culture, and the expectation that, you would die gloriously for your master because that was the highest calling of a samurai. So one of the most famous stories in all of Japan is that of the 47 Rōnin, which is a story about a group of samurai avenging the death of their lord. And then ultimately they all killed themselves at the end. I think. If that's not correct, you can correct me, but I think that's what it is. They avenge his lord, and the ones who don't die in the battle, they commit, harakiri, because that's, that's what they had to do. Because again, that was an honorable way to do, to die. But also in older samurai films, the fight scenes were a lot more choreographed and graceful and clean. Whereas in Seven Samurai, the battle scenes are chaotic and they're dirty and they're brutal and they're messy. So, so I think Seven Samurai serves as the foundation for his future samurai films like The Hidden Fortress and Yojimbo and Ron. So Akira Kurosawa was a filmmaker who liked to use the same actors in his own films. He was one of those directors that created his own company by this point, where many of the actors in the film had already been in his other films. As I said, this was Mifune had been started with him 6 years earlier, and this was actually Mifune's 7th film with Kurosawa. So Takashi Shimura, who played Kanbei, this was his 12th film with Kurosawa. And then many other actors like Daisuke Kato, who played Shichiroji, or Minoru Chiaki, who played Heihachi, and then Yoshio Tsuchiya, who played Rikichi, and Bokuzen Hidari, who played Yohei, would appear in multiple Kurosawa films. So, you find great actors, you want to keep working with them. And that's what he did. So, and like many of the greatest film directors of all time, Kurosawa had his own cinematic language and techniques that were signature to him. So, Seven Samurai is actually a bridge in Kurosawa's career, where it stopped, where he stopped or he drastically reduced using certain techniques that he relied on in earlier films and started using other techniques that he would carry on for the rest of his career. So, for instance, prior to Seven Samurai, Kurosawa would use a lot of wide-angle shots, but after Seven Samurai, that would change. Seven Samurai was the first film that he started extensively using telephoto lenses. So, and using a telephoto lens, what that does is it flattens the plane of the frame. So it compresses everything so that the images, the characters, objects look much closer together than they actually are. So an early example of this in the film is in the beginning scene when the farmers are discussing the bandits and what they're going to do. And Rikichi is trying to tell them that they need to fight, but then he gets very frustrated. And as a result, he leaves the circle that the farmers are all sitting in, and he goes to go squat and kind of be on his own. So that's the first kind of big example of a telephoto lens. But then there's other examples of when Kurosawa is using telephoto lenses, which features a lot more prominently in the second half of the film, mainly during the action sequences. So when the bandits are first approaching the village barrier, they build barriers around the village. So when we see the horses come there, those are telephoto shots. During multiple charging attempts in the early stages of the siege, we see them because he liked to, because the camera would typically be low to the ground and it would shoot through the horse's legs, because again, it would create, it would make the action seem, more compact and more exciting than it being further away. And then where the telephoto lenses are most extensively used are in the final rain battle, but again, this, as I said, this was a bridge. So he used telephoto lenses, but he did also use wide lens shots in the film as well. So, but then also Kurosawa utilized extreme close-ups on characters' faces. So he would use this particularly when showing the desperation and the fear on the farmers' faces. So now, and then one of the most influential techniques he pioneered in the film, even though he doesn't use it very much, he only uses it twice, was the use of slow motion. So, but but the way he did it, even though he didn't use it very much, because he doesn't use it in any of the battle scenes later on in the film, he only uses it in the beginning with Kanbei's introduction and Kyuzo's introduction. But it's the way he did it that became the standard for all action film directors. He would use the same technique afterwards. So in the scene where Kanbei rescues the child from the thief, what Kurosawa does is he doesn't just show a unbroken slow motion shot. What he does is Kurosawa intercuts between the moments of slow motion and regular speed. So because prior to this, when slow motion was used, it would only be it would just be the slow motion shot and then would go back. But by intercutting between the camera speeds, Kurosawa disrupted the timing of the sequence, which created more dramatic tension. So, and then another signature filmmaking choice Kurosawa used first in Seven Samurai was having a 3-camera setup. And he did this so that he could capture mostly the action sequences in 3 different perspectives. So often there would be one camera that would be getting the master wide shot. Then there would be another, one camera that would be usually, I think that would be camera A, and then camera B would be getting the medium shot, and then camera C would be getting the close-up shot. So, and Kurosawa was an editor. So he believed that by having 3 different cameras, it would make editing easier without him having to film like more insert shots and other, like pickup shots. So the biggest challenge was actually making it so that the cameras didn't actually see each other on film. So, but another thing that Kurosawa was known for was having very dynamic camera movements, like quick pans or tracking shots. So, for instance, there was the opening shot of the bandits coming over the hill, approaching the village, which is this beautiful tracking kind of dawn shot. And then also there's a sequence when Kikuchiyo is falsely sounding the alarm, where it's not quite a pan, it's like a pan cut, but again, it's a very dynamic sequence where all the samurai are running from the mill thinking that the bandits are attacking. So it shows there's these quick cuts of the samurai running. So it's like cut, track, cut, track, cut, track. So that's a very, high energy editing sequence. Because again, he actually lets a lot of the film breathe editing wise. He doesn't do a lot of quick cutting. So, but in regards to like the camera movements, he would sometimes combine the two, panning, to create, panning tracking shots that to me are probably some of his most interesting films or interesting shots in the film. So, some of the examples of that are when they're in the inn and the farmers are initially talking to Kanbei, or when Kanbei is initially trying to test a group or, test the samurai to join the group, where he has Katsushiro stand at the side with a piece of wood, hoping that, saying that it's going to come down, but the way that it's framed, he moves the camera and then, moves it back so that you can kind of get the full sense of the framing. So, and I actually, one of my favorite shots of the film is towards the middle, where there's a group of farmers that almost try to mutiny, because they don't think that they can win and that they're gonna give up or that they're gonna surrender, and so Kanbei has to kind of get them back in line. So what he does is he basically, the shot starts with Kanbei, he unsheathes his sword and then he runs towards the farmers. The farmers, they get scared. And so, we see the camera follow Kanbei as he's approaching the farmers. The farmers move around, and then Kanbei turns to get them back to the other group of farmers, and the camera doesn't stop. So it starts with him, it moves back, and then it turns to watch the farmers move, and then it gets the perspective of Kanbei getting them back in line. So that's probably my favorite shot of the film personally. So, and then another great shot is when Kikucho is actually taunting the bandits. So the camera, starts with him, kind of walking up and kind of giving his, kind of wild antics. And then a shot rings out and he runs back towards the barrier. So, and as he's running, the camera tracks him backwards, through the water. And then it pans as he's moving up to get back over the barrier. And this is actually considered one of the most dynamic shots of the film. So, and then obviously during many of the action sequences, the camera is moving quite a bit. So as far as camera movement, he was one of the masters at dynamic camera movements. So, but then also Kurosawa was a very elemental director because he loved using natural elements for dramatic effect. So, and the two most prominent ones that he would use would usually be rain and fire. So he used wind a lot too. So for instance, like in the film, there's moments where we see wind blowing, but it doesn't quite have as strong of in my opinion, it doesn't have as strong of dramatic resonance as the rain and the fire does. So with the rain, rain is one of his most prominent atmospheric tools. So he uses it in multiple films. And in Seven Samurai, rain appears in multiple scenes. So the first time it rains, it's soon after the farmers arrive in the town to find the samurai. And then we also see a long rain sequence when they're back at the village, which features Kyuzo going to practice initially in the rain. So we see him, pulling his sword out in the forest with the rain. So it's a very beautiful composed shot. That's another thing. The composition of the shots are extraordinarily gorgeous. So, even though I said earlier that I feel like, that Kurosawa didn't want to make, didn't want to make a beautiful film in a way, he still made a beautiful film in his way, in a realistic way. So, he's practiced. So Kyuzo's practicing in the rain, but then it also leads to when we see Katsushiro and Shino meeting and Kyuzo watching. And then of course the biggest sequence, is, the finale sequence that takes place in the rain. The rain creates makes the scene much more dramatic. So, but then again, on the opposite side of the coin, you have fire. So water on one side, fire on the other. And fire is also one of Kurosawa's most recurring elements. So one of the reasons being is I like to joke that Kurosawa loved building his own sets just so he could burn them down. So because every time Kurosawa would burn down a building, he filmed it in a very spectacular way. He would often linger on the conflagration, which allows you to really appreciate the beauty and the destruction of the flames. So, when some of the farmers' homes are on fire and they're burning, Kurosawa holds the frame to see part of the houses collapse. So there's really no reason to watch it unless to just admire the fire. So, but in Seven Samurai, the two most impressive fire sequences are when the bandits hideout burns down and when the village mill is burning. Now, the burning of the fortress was very high stakes behind the scenes because the set was so large they could only afford to burn it down once. So they had to get everything. And this is also where the multiple cameras come in. You set up multiple cameras, you get multiple shots, you don't have to try to worry about reshooting it. So, but then the burning of the mill is particularly dramatic because it serves as that backdrop for, Kikucho's emotional confession when he's holding the child. So again, the elements play a very important role. They say that everything in Kurosawa's film is deliberately there. So the rain is there for a specific purpose, the fire is there for a specific purpose, the wind is there for a specific purpose. So now and because of Kurosawa's revolutionary film and story techniques, that's the main reason why Seven Samurai has remained a classic since it was initially released. Now, Seven Samurai was a massive crossover global hit. It wasn't just successful in Japan, but it was successful all over the world, as I said before. It was the film that introduced the samurai film to the rest of the world. And it's a major reason, and it's a major reason why the film became so influential. So Seven Samurai is often cited as one of the most influential films of all time. Now, whether Kurosawa intended on this happening or not, I can't be sure. But my guess is he made the best film he could, and it was so magnificent, it couldn't help but be incredibly influential. No one had ever seen films like this before. So, and the influence of Seven Samurai can be found on a macro level, for instance, with many films that serve as direct remakes across multiple genres, as well as on a micro level from, the filmmakers being influenced by Kurosawa's filming techniques. So we'll start with the macro level. So Seven Samurai has been remade multiple times. And the first remake was actually John Sturgis's 1960 film, The Magnificent Seven, which is, it's a solid remake. It's not, but it doesn't have nearly the same kind of narrative depth or beauty that Seven Samurai does. Magnificent Seven, it's a great action film. It's a great Western, but it does not come close to Seven Samurai. And I think, and I think because Seven Samurai films, and American Westerns shared much of the same DNA, that's why they would often get remade of each other. So, samurai films would get made into Westerns, Westerns would get made into samurai films. But other examples, in other genres would be films, the sci-fi films, Battle Beyond the Stars, or Zack Snyder's more recent Rebel Moon. It went into comedy. So, for instance, Three Amigos. And then it even went into animation with Pixar's A Bug Life. So, because the story was just, the story was so universal, it could be transcribed to so many different genres. So, but again, so that was on the macro level. Now, on the micro level, some of the specific elements that Kurosawa used became greatly influential on future filmmakers. For instance, were the use of slow motion, which influenced the likes of action directors like Sam Peckinpah, John Woo, and Zack Snyder. So, and then, his use of extreme character close-ups is something Sergio Leone would use to great effect in his Westerns, most notably in The Good and the Bad and the Ugly and Once Upon a Time in the West. So, and then as I said before, Seven Samurai was a film that popularized the assembling the team trope in action films. So where, you have your leader and then it's like, we got to get our team together. So every film that you've seen that basically came out that has that structure was influenced by Seven Samurai. So films like The Guns of Navarone, The Dirty Dozen, Ocean's 11, Inception, and The Avengers even all took their cue from Seven Samurai. So, but again, on a total level, Seven Samurai is widely considered one of the greatest films of all time. And on virtually every list in existence that ranks the best films of all time, Seven Samurai is there. Because like Citizen Kane before it, its lasting legacy is tied to the high number of revolutionary film techniques it pioneered and popularized, as well as just being an outstanding film. Because even without all the technical knowledge, the film is still incredible to watch. But at a base level, Seven Samurai hasn't endured for over 70 years because of its technical prowess or pioneering techniques alone. Seven Samurai endures because its, beautiful and wonderful art is timeless. And maybe this is one of the benefits of telling a period piece, but the story and the themes of Seven Samurai are universal and they're not rooted to a particular, to the time and the culture specifically. Yes, it's in the 16th century, it's in the Sengoku period in Japan, but because Kurosawa focused on these universal themes, It's why the film can be remade over and over again in different countries, in different genres, and in different time periods, and not lose any of its thematic or dramatic weight. Now, I will say that Akira Kurosawa is my favorite film director of all time. Every film of his, in my opinion, ranks as either great to a masterpiece. And to me, Kurosawa is one of the few filmmakers I see as having no bad films in his career. So, he's got so many fantastic films that it's incredibly difficult to choose a favorite. But Kurosawa specifically has a special place in my heart as a cinephile because his films are what introduced me to the Criterion Collection. The first Criterion film I ever bought 20 years ago was The Hidden Fortress. And if it wasn't for Kurosawa, this channel and the show wouldn't exist. So now I would probably rank Seven Samurai as, probably in my top 5 of Kurosawa films, but I don't know where I would rank it. Because it's, again, that's just too hard. It's difficult to it's too difficult. But and to be fair, it's also difficult to pin down what I love most about Seven Samurai because I think everything in the movie is outstanding. But what I truly love about Seven Samurai is one of those films that reminds me of how beautiful and powerful cinema is. It's a film that it's not just an action film. It's not just it's an incredible piece of storytelling. And to me, it is the absolute pinnacle of cinema as an art form. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to start the show. So I love how Seven Samurai is a perfectly structured and paced film. There are no wasted scenes or moments. Everything makes the story move. And to me, the best films that's what they do is there's nothing extraneous. There's nothing gratuitous or superficial. And again, considering that the film is over 3 hours long, that's an incredibly impressive accomplishment. The only other films I can think of that come close to that in a way would be the Lord of the Rings films, which people argue, whether or not those films are as tightly paced narratively. But Seven Samurai is, even though it's 3.5 hours long, it just goes. It just zips by. So, but then all of the performances in the film were terrific. I spent a lot of time on Toshiro Mifune, but the entire cast is wonderful. So, Takashi Shimura is fantastic. And, all of the other actors are in it. Unfortunately, the actors' names, because, they're all, they're not as easy to remember for me as say Mifune and Shimura are, because Mifune and Shimura were in so many, Kurosawa films that I've been able to commit their names to memory a lot better. But again, the entire cast is fantastic. And the way the film is shot is gorgeous. So, but I think, the one thing that I appreciate the most about Seven Samurai is how much I learned about film and filmmaking from it. It's not one of the greatest films of all time for no reason. So, it's one of the, just going through the special features on the Criterion Blu-ray that I have, could be a film course all on its own, because it's a film that you can always find new things to appreciate and learn from in every rewatch that you have, because the film is so rich. So, and what makes Kurosawa such a genius director is his films can be seen and appreciated on multiple levels. So, Kurosawa believed stories should be simple to understand, and that the most important thing was to entertain the audience first. And I think as a result of that mindset, you can watch Seven Samurai for the first time and only see it as a story about, poor farmers being terrorized by the bandits and having to hire the samurai to protect them. And the film just completely works just as a straightforward action film because it's so well made and entertaining. You can watch it just as this, men on a mission film, and it's terrific. But it's when you rewatch the film from, a few times is when you start to pick up on the deeper elements and the themes, and you start to realize how exceptionally brilliant the film truly is. And then obviously, if you watch the special features, whether it's on the DVD or the Blu-ray or on streaming, that gives you probably, the deepest academic insight into the film. So my commentary itself could only cover so much ground because, I don't want to overwhelm you, even though this has been a long episode, by trying to examine everything about Seven Samurai. But even with everything I talked about, you can still watch the film and catch things that I didn't mention. So I definitely recommend watching the film many times if you genuinely want to, discover all the layers and the depth to the film. So now, regarding how you can watch the film, you can buy all 3 formats of the film on Criterion's website: the DVD, the Blu-ray, which I have, or on 4K, or you can watch it on the Criterion channel. It's one of their staples there. And the Criterion channel has actually most of his films. So, so it's very, unlike Grand Illusion, the first one, which is a little harder to track down, this film is very easy to watch. They're very easy to find. So with that said, I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of the Criterion Chronicle. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure that you like, share, and subscribe to the channel so that you can keep going with me. Up next on the Criterion Chronicle, I will be covering one of Alfred Hitchcock's most fun and charming mysteries, Criterion Spine number 3, The Lady Vanishes. So if you want to continue on this journey with me through the Criterion Collection, then again, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.